Radio TV Phono Nut here, and we have a circa 82, 83 Zenith 17-inch Space Command color set that we are going to try to repair today. Quite frankly, I wasn't aware that Zenith was still making a 17-inch TV new enough to be cable ready and remote control, and I believe this one has the 9-181 signal board and the 9-186 horizontal sweep and high voltage module, which I also wasn't aware that they were making a 17-inch set that late. I've seen some 9-160 based Zenith that were 17-inch, but never one this new. But I know that Zenith had a huge senior citizen following, so I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that they were still making a 17-inch set this late, as well as a 23-inch set with the rounded corner picture tube. But anyway, I got this set from the flea market several years ago. They gave it to me, and when I saw it playing, it had as good a picture as you would expect to see on a television. Bright, sharp, good grayscale. But when I got it home and plugged it in after it had a chance to cool down, it had sound and high voltage but no raster. And I just let it play a while, and after it stayed on 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the makings of a picture. Very dark, very blurry, looked like a weak CRT. And then the longer it stayed on, the better the picture got, until it finally got to peak performance, and by that time it was, like I said, as good a picture as you would want to see on a television. Now that could be a weak picture tube, but I have a hard time believing that, because usually when a picture tube is that dead, it usually does not come up to peak performance within 10 or 15 minutes. It usually won't come up to peak performance at all. So I'm thinking that there's something going on in the filament line, which I believe is powered off of the flyback transformer. Some possible faults could be bad solder connections, which after the set heats up, they make good enough connection to provide full filament voltage to the picture tube, whereas when the set is cold, it's a high resistance joint that is limiting our filament voltage to the picture tube. We could have corroded contacts on the CRT socket, as well as pins on the CRT. And if there's a fusible resistor in line with the filament string, with the filament supply, that resistor could have gone up in value, and then once the set heats up, and the resistor heats up from current being drawn through it, the resistor could be going back down to normal value and allowing the picture tube to see the 6.3 volts that it wants to receive. Now this set's been sitting in my basement, which is not the best of storage conditions, for several years now, so there's a good chance that when I turn this on, it's going to have more problems than it did to start with, and I really hope that's not the case, because my 19-inch Zenith from 1984, you've seen it before, the one with the rotary dial mechanical tuner, has developed an issue. It's still watchable, but the picture is a bit too snowy for my liking, and I've tried swapping cables in the 300 ohm to 75 ohm baling to no avail. So that tells me that set's got either tuner or AGC issues. But given the short amount of time I have, and given the lack of bench space I have, I really don't have time to get into no elaborate troubleshooting procedure. So that's why I pulled this set out. Hopefully we can troubleshoot this filament voltage problem in short order, and then I'll put it in place of the 19-inch set, and then whenever I get the 19-inch set fixed, whenever that is, then I'll put it back in service. But actually, as I recall, when this set was working properly, it had a better picture than the 19-inch set had. I think this TV uses the trifocus picture tube with the EFL gun, and to me those those tubes had a brighter, sharper picture than the standard garden variety inline tube that they used later on. Now, I did see my fair share of these types of tubes that were defective, but it was mainly in the 23-inch and 25-inch sets. The 19-inch and smaller screen sizes generally didn't give a whole lot of trouble, but we know there's a first time for everything. Okay, let me go dig up an extension cord and we'll power this up and see if it smokes or what does it do. Now, this is the original remote that needs to be cleaned up, and you can tell by the cracks in the case it's been dropped a few times. I also need to replace the 9-volt battery connector because the original Duraswell battery that was in it, or the, shall I say, the battery that was in it when I got it, had leaked and corroded the terminal off of the battery snaps. That'll have to be replaced. But at least this remote is screwed together and can easily be taken apart, unlike some of these newer remotes that snap together. And a lot of those are a real pain in the butt to open, and you usually end up scoring up the plastic, getting them apart. So let's go get a power cord and fire this thing up and see what happens. And just for the record, I really didn't care for the Zenith sets that use the 9-160 power supply board, or these later ones with the 9-181 and 186 modules. They could be a pain in the butt to troubleshoot sometimes. And there were times when parts on one module would fail and cause damage to another module, and then you would replace one module not knowing if there was something wrong with the second module, and then you'd end up screwing up the module that you just replaced. I like the older Zenith Chromacolor 2s and the 4-tube hybrid sets with the Delta Gun CRTs. Those were pretty much straightforward, no kind of exotic circuitry, and they were easy to troubleshoot. But I'd still take one of these Zeniths like what you see here today over some of this junk they make now, and those crappy 1990s Zeniths from the Gold Star era that had the picture tubes that would go bad prematurely. They would either go weak or intermittently short out and burn up parts in the power supply and or the video driver stages. And I've seen some of those sets that look like they had bad picture tubes right out of the box, and I can tell you the rebuilt replacements were no better. I remember buying one 27-inch Zenith rebuilt tube. I think it was an Optichrome brand. This was back around 94, back when such a TV was still worth something. And this was a nice set that had a bunch of features on it, and it wasn't long before that rebuilt tube shorted and took out the power supply in that TV. So alright, we're plugged in. Let's turn it on, see if it blows up or what. Alright, we have high voltage, we have sound.
I'm making my own way forward. Ask your doctor about everyday Verzenio. I get bladder leaks. I didn't want to feel.
And as you can tell, we have no picture as of yet.
Then I tried the always discreet pads.
Well, it just flashed at me a little bit there.
Look how much it holds, and it still stays thin.
Alright, I'm seeing a little picture now, very, very blurry. Seemed to me like it took longer for this to warm up.
My asthma felt
You see, that does look like a very tired, very weak picture tube.
Nucala is a once-monthly add-on injection for severe eosinophilic asthma. Nucala is not for sudden breathing problems. Allergic reactions can occur.
I don't want my son to grow up like that without his dad in the picture.
Well, we unfortunately. Damn. So something blew up.
Oh, honey, you broke it, huh? Or it broke itself.
I bet that was the boost filter capacitor that blew up.
I hope her problems are always that small.
I guess we'll know when we pull the back off. Yeah, those unexpected capacitor blow-ups can catch you off guard sometimes. Now we can tell that this set was basically an early run when they got away from the 9-160 and the 9-155 video driver module, because this back cover still has the removable panel here that you could remove if the service technician needed to access the screen controls on the CRT driver module. But on these sets with the 9-181 signal board, the G2 controls are on the signal module itself. Alright, let's pull the back and see what we got. Alright, come on off of there. Did I miss a screw, or are you just wanting to be cantankerous? I just think you're wanting to be cantankerous. Alright, here we go, and this set is fairly dirty inside. This here is our tuner, this is our standby power supply and tuner control. This is our 9-181 signal board. This is our CRT socket. And this is our 9-186 high voltage and horizontal sweep module. And I think I see what capacitor blew up here. Don't I see some foil blown up here? So yeah. And then that little transformer there is our kickstart transformer. When you first turn the set on, we have a kickstart circuit to briefly energize the horizontal output stage. And then once that happens, the flyback transformer takes over, producing all of the voltage that the set needs. So, alright, let's get this pulled apart and see what we're going to have to do to it. First, we need to replace that capacitor that blew up. Yeah, that capacitor blew its top, didn't it? And that does look like the boost filter. And there it is right there, what's left of it. Now, as I recall, that's a 10 microfarad 315 volt cap. Very common failure in Zenith televisions of this era. In fact, it's a very common failure in all brands of sets. And when it fails, depending on the set, the symptom usually is one half of the picture will be darker than the other half, or the picture will be excessively bright with retrace lines. Alright, so let's get this board out and replace that cap and give it a good look over and see if we find anything else that looks suspect on here. In order to remove this board, you just have to slide it back, and these little plastic rails on the side clip into the cabinet bottom, and that's what holds it in place. And then you unplug all the cables. Each cable is marked with a series of numbers and letters that correspond to a series of numbers and letters that are marked on each plug on the circuit board, so you can put the board back in easily. Now, Zenith was one of the last holdouts as far as modularized television chassis construction. In fact, they held on to that concept up until the end of the CRT era, although in the later years the module was actually everything on one board, and you just replaced the whole board when something went wrong, only to find that the CRT was probably going to short and blow it up again. However, whenever I was fixing used TVs to sell, for a little while I was replacing modules until it got to the point where replacing modules was costing too much. So whenever possible, I would always troubleshoot them down to the component level. Right, here's our circuit board out of the cabinet. There's our remnants of blown up capacitor, and I got a little rust here on this shield, which may or may not have taken place while this was under my care. But we'll try to clean this up a little bit, go over things, make sure there's no bad solder connections. I'm also going to test these caps in the vertical circuit. Those were bad about causing problems. I think this one right here especially, if my memory serves me correctly. But yeah, when this capacitor went boom, it went boom. Like I said, I think it's a 10 microfarad 315 volt. but I'm going to replace it with a 10 microfarad. Shouldn't be that critical. Got a stand-up power resistor here that has some questionable connections on it. There's a resistor here that might need to be resoldered. Overall, this looks pretty good just from what I can see, but I know me looking at it is not going to always tell the story. The best thing to do when in doubt is resolder anyway. Oh, and another thing I didn't like back when you replace these 9-181 modules, I remember the replacements did not come with the ICs, so you had to unsocket the ICs from your old board and put it in the new board. Well, what if one of your ICs was bad? And then I think later they came out with a version that you could buy that had all the ICs on it. I think some of them actually had the ICs hard soldered to the board rather than socketed. August 1982 or 3, Springfield, Missouri. Even that label is about to wear out. So yeah, this was a USA made set, so that makes me happy. Well, at least these shields here are not rusted, just the one on the signal module. There's our picture tube. Trying to look for any date codes on that. 17 VBN P22. Zenith trifocus picture tube with EFL gun. And I think that's the date code, what, 49th week of 83. Or, assuming that's the original tube, well, that would make this an 83 model set. Alright, I got the capacitor replaced, and I'm just going through randomly resoldering anything that looks questionable. This one looks more questionable off camera than it does on camera, but it can't hurt to resolder it. Now that looks a little bit better. And this resistor here, it was the worst connection right here, which is a common problem. Hot power resistor. In years of off and on cycling, heating and cooling, it just stands to reason that that's going to pop loose. Alright, I resoldered anything that looked remotely questionable. I ran an ESR test on these key capacitors in the power supply and vertical circuit. They all test okay. The only capacitor that was bad, obviously, was this boost filter that you see here, that brown capacitor there. So I'm about ready to go put the board back in the television, and then we will go from there. And then I want to also look at the CRT socket board and see if there's any deficiencies there. In fact, I might just resolder it just to be on the safe side. Alright, looking at the pins on the CRT socket, they all look nice and shiny. So far what I'm seeing on the CRT itself, those pins look okay. Let me get under the bottom side and look. And as far as I can tell, all the pins here look okay. So let me pull this insulator off of this CRT socket board and see what those connections look like. Alright, that connector there is our CRT filament. And those connections, they don't look too terribly bad, but I'll resolder them anyway. And then we'll make an ohm meter check across here and see what we have here. While we're waiting on the soldering iron to warm up, some would just go through this and recap the circuit board, or every circuit board in it. I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't do it even if I knew for definite that this CRT was good. Under normal circumstances, I test the tube, but my CRT tester that's new enough to test these types of tubes is decided it's not going to work for me, so that'll be something else we have to fix one day. But no, I'm not going to go through and recap an 80s or newer television set. I'll replace the ones that are bad and maybe some that have a history of high failure, and that's going to be about it. Right, there's our board all resoldered and cleaned up. Now we'll clean up our insulator and put that back in place. That's there to protect the serviceman from getting the crap knocked out of him or her, whatever the case may be. While adjusting things on the deflection yoke and convergence, it would be real easy for their hand to come in contact with this, and that wouldn't be very pleasant. Alright, I'm measuring across the heater pins on the CRT socket board, and I'm reading 1.4, 1.5 ohms. So that seems to be about right. So there's no compromised connection there that I can tell. In reading across our secondary winding, I'm reading about 0.1 ohms. So that seems about right. So if we power this up and it takes an excessively long time for the picture to come up to snuff, then that will probably indicate that we have a tired CRT. But it's like I said, when a CRT is that tired, they usually don't go from 0 to 100 miles per hour within a 10-minute period. They may come up a little bit, but they usually don't come up to a perfect picture. So we'll just see what happens here shortly. Alright, we have the board back in place. I hope we have everything connected up properly. Let's find out. Well, I guess we got something right. We have high voltage and sound.
Watch every weeknight to make your choice. Laugh till you choose, and then
Our picture is slowly coming up, but not as quick as I'd like it to. Notice how blurry it is down here. So I'm just going to let it play a few minutes, see what happens. But our color control has no effect. It's like it's wide open, and the tint control is having no effect either. So did I fail to plug in something? Our picture and black level are working. But you see how that's blowing out some when I turn the black level up and the picture control up. See how that's blooming out? So yeah, we might very well just have a weak tube here. And there's no chromatic button on this set, so it's not like the auto color control is overriding anything. So let's see why this color and tint control is having no effect. Oops, I did forget to plug in something. Connector 2B7, and that's over here by the chroma IC. So yeah, that could be why our tint and color controls are having no effect on things. Alright, let's reapply power and see if that's better. Alright, take 2.
Like she said, was going back
Channel
and forth.
3.
Like at first, she was mad at that. Well, not mad. She was just like kind of like with the age thing. Like I'm telling her that is
very long warm-up time here. I have the color control set at minimum.
But as far as the jealousy,
our grayscale looks pretty good. It's just taking a very long time to warm up here.
Where you from?
Alright, that looks pretty good. Unfortunately, we don't have a crepe erase channel like Shango has, but we do have our Judge Mathis channel. I might have to go get the old camera because I think it does a better job at capturing the picture. I think it's just a frame rate issue, but I'm not sure how to adjust that on this newer camera. We don't have our home shopping channel here, probably because the powers that be know that people in my area are not interested in buying anything except liquor and smartphones, so there's no need in having a home shopping channel.
Designed to make setup simple. Save up to 40% with our friends and family sale at Balsam
This
Hill.
thing's starting to look a little better the more it warms up, but I think this tube is a little bit on the tired side. Now I will tell you something about these trifocus EFL gun tubes that Zenith used, and I believe Sylvania and Sanyo often used them in some of their sets as well. it's been my experience that even with a good rejuvenator, those do not rejuvenate very well. In fact, I'm trying to remember, in over 30 years of doing this, have I ever had one that rejuvenated to any decency. Usually they looked worse after the fact than they did beforehand, and if they came up at all, they usually didn't stay up long, and then they usually fell back down and looked worse than they did before we started. So I'm not going to attempt to rejuvenate this tube. It may take a few minutes for it to warm up, but it looks pretty good once it warms up, and that's just the way we're gonna leave it. And if I could find a tube for this set, I'd fix it, because this would have a jam up good picture if it had a good jug in it. But as we know, CRTs are not as prominent as they used to be, since nobody's rebuilding them anymore and nobody's making them anymore. Unless I found a new old stock one somewhere, or a strong one from a junk set, then I'd be out of luck on this. The only other thing I might could do to this would be to put a brightener on it, and I really don't like doing that unless it's an absolute last resort. And as long as this one still looks watchable, even though it takes it a few minutes to warm up, then I'd rather leave it alone. And one thing you can do without putting a brightener on one, you can wrap a turn or two of wire around the flyback core and wire it in series with the filament winding, and that'll give you a little bit more voltage. Normally 6.3 volts is what the CRT wants, but when it's weak you can bump it up to like 7 volts or 7.5 volts, and that'll usually buy you a little more time, but it's not a permanent fix. The only permanent fix would be a good picture tube, not rejuvenation, not a brightener, a picture tube. The only thing rejuvenation is going to do is buy you a little more time. And how long it'll last depends on the quality of your CRT tester and the type of tube you're rejuvenating. It's been my experience the old Delta gun tubes will usually take a jolt and keep going. These inline gun tubes, not so much. Some better than others, but not these trifocus EFL type guns, and not Sony Trinitrons. Sony Trinitrons are another one that generally will, we have our test pattern channel too. Shango has his radio station, this is only a test. We have our TV station, this is only a test. And this has been coming soon for about the past year and a half now. Somebody told me this is eventually going to end up being Next Gen 3.0 or whatever. It's the new format that they're going to be rolling out that's coming soon. Something that will end up making obsolete once again the current standard. And of course our converter boxes and our current round of flat screen TVs with digital tuners will not be compatible with this new standard. They're saying the FCC is not mandating it, but
what are some of the
eventually that the TV stations will end up switching to it. Is that the commish?
Honey, what's going on?
Yep, that's the commish.
And then the lamp?
That's probably the last TV show, current TV show that I watched on a regular basis, and I think it went off the air in like 95 or 96, so that gives you an idea how long it's been since I've kept up with our current TV. I'm fixing to turn this off. We're going to button it back up. We're going to try to repair that remote, and then we'll turn it on again in a few hours and see how long it takes it to warm up to a normal picture. Now you see I have a helper coming up here trying to tell me how to do things while I try to get this plastic back reinstalled that does not want to line up right, which seems to be the case with a lot of those plastic TV backs. You have to hold your mouth right to get them to fit back on. Alright, I'm on the old camera while we wait on the battery to charge for the other one, and I forgot to elaborate on the boost filter capacitor. What its actual purpose is. Coming off of the flyback transformer, they derive the voltage for the video output stage for the CRT drive circuitry. They rectify that voltage coming off of the flyback and then filter it via that boost filter capacitor, and you end up with about 200-250 volts. And like I've said before, when that capacitor opens, which is a common problem in all brands of CRT televisions, although they often don't go in as big of a fanfare as this one did, they usually just dry out and don't work anymore. But you can have an excessively bright picture with retrace lines, or you can have streaks in the picture, or vertical jail bars on one side of the screen, or half of the picture is darker than the other half of the screen, stuff like that. If you ever run into those problems, that capacitor just might very well be your issue. And as far as the CRT brightener, when a tube gets weak, it's because the cathode of the picture tube has become contaminated over time and is not emitting the amount of electrons that it once did. And what they can do to compensate for that is that they can get the filament, run the filament at a slightly higher voltage. That will heat the cathode to a hotter temperature, which will cause more electrons to boil off. And like I've said before, that'll buy you a little time. It's not a permanent fix. Whereas rejuvenation, basically what that's doing is placing a high voltage between the cathode and the grid to arc between those two elements, and it's supposed to burn all the crud off of the cathode, exposing a new layer of good cathode emitting material. But sometimes not only does rejuvenation take the crud, it takes some of the good stuff with it too. Now that problem is not as bad with newer rejuvenators that are current limited and controlled, but with old rejuvenators like the first one I ever had, a B&K 465 that was a gift from a TV shop in the early 90s. It was long obsolete, but it helped me out a lot in my early years of fixing TVs, because a lot of what I was finding was old black and white sets and old Delta Gun color sets. But that particular tester basically has no current limiting. They're just charging up a capacitor and just dumping the whole capacitor, one big slam dunk between the cathode and the grid. And I'm going to tell you, my experience with that tester, you better not go higher than the lowest setting. And I never had much luck rejuvenating any sort of color tube with that tester. Now the old big neck black and white tubes, yeah, I saved a few of them, bought a few of them a little more time, but that's about all I can say for that. Alright, this has been off a while. Let's turn it on and see how long it takes the picture to come up to full. Oh, we're on this weather channel. I better turn that down. Seems to be warming up a bit quicker now, so who knows? Maybe this set just needs to be used and woke up. Yeah, typical buzz-o-matic Zenith. Writing on the screen, buzz in the audio.
We're talking about what some are calling
the picture's not too terribly bad on this set. Yeah, Me TV, that's about the only thing I'm going to watch.
What do you think about the new dig?
On over-the-air TV, except the local news. 34, that's an out-of-town religious station that I can usually can't get it in the daytime.
We want to remind you that the #1...
Here's the inside of that Zenith remote, a little bit different than your typical 21st century remote. This one's actually made to be taken apart and serviced. And I'm going to take it apart and try to clean up the keypad. You know, it's probably cruddy. And then I need to locate a battery snap to put on here. You see what happens when a Duracell battery decides to leak, but at least all it appears to have done was take out the battery snap. On second thought, this may not be so serviceable. We have these little tension clips that go over these plastic pegs to hold everything together, and I'm really afraid to try to pry too much on these because I don't want these plastic pegs to break. So we may just have to splice on another connector and insulate it with heat shrink tubing, and if it works, great. If it don't, we'll just have to go get a universal remote. Well, what do you know, I was able to get all 4 of them off without breaking them. But you know how it is with 40-year-old plastic, it can snap on you. But I'm glad we were able to get the tabs off. Well, it's still not wanting to come out, and we have buttons flying everywhere, so this is going to be a bit of a pain. Well, it looks like the thing shut off on us. We have channel indication, but no picture. So what happened? Did we lose high voltage or what? Probably so.
It's province. Sit on it. Plus bread items. Match.
What's buns?
That's it. And the final clue, remembering Alex Trebek. Alex's breakfast of choice was a Diet Coke and
Okay, now we have no picture whatsoever. And it just shut down on us. So what's going on here? So it looks like we've got more to do to this set. I don't know that I really want to. But when I turn it on, I hear a little pop in the speaker. And then whenever I turn it off, I hear this weird sound. And I don't think I've ever heard one of these make that sound before. So, yeah, this is going to take some troubleshooting to the component level because it's not like I can get the modules anymore. Okay, back apart with the television. So we replaced the boost filter and resoldered some questionable solder connections, and that got the TV working. Thought we had it repaired, put the back on it, and then within a few minutes it shut off, except for the green channel LED indicator, which is independent of the TV chassis. It gets its juice from the standby power supply over here. So this is one of those reasons why a lot of TV shops back in the day would not work on a TV over a certain age. I knew some around here would not work on a TV over 10 years old, and sometime in the mid to late 80s most TV shops had gotten to the point where they would not accept a vacuum tube based TV in for repair. In fact, some of them would get kind of snippy if you brought a tube TV to them and wanted it fixed. In fact, I had one TV repairman tell me years ago, he said I had to work on that junk whenever it was new, and I don't have to work on it anymore, and as old as it is, people just need to retire it and get another one. And as far as the not working on a TV over a certain age, I understand why, because you get a set just like this one, for example. You replace the bad part, you think it's fixed, you send it home, it goes out again, and then they bring it back expecting a free repair out of the deal, even though what went out may be totally unrelated to what you fixed. You might have fixed it for a no picture condition, and then next week the sound goes out and they bring it back to you and expect a free repair out of the deal, and then you fix that, and then next week something else goes out, and you end up getting married to a television that you keep having to fix for free because, you know, the customer doesn't understand and doesn't want to understand. Now they think that because you fix the television, then you ought to guarantee the whole thing. I know a friend of mine did warranty work. Well, not really warranty work, but he did work for a local salvage business here that got a lot of televisions from Western Auto and places like that, TVs that had damage, and he'd get my friend to fix them and then he'd resell them. Well, he brought him I think it was a Wells Gardner built True Tone console, and he fixed one problem in it, and they paid him, and they took it back, and then a week later they brought it back and the tripler was bad, and my friend fixed it, and the guy that owned the store refused to pay him. He said, "No, I'm not going to pay you. You fixed it one time and you should have known that part was going to fail." And my friend said, "Well, it's a sealed unit. It either works or it don't work. I can't just look at it and tell if it's going to fail." Well, I'm not going to pay you for fixing it. And my friend said, "Well, okay, I'll even up with you one day." And he said, I got even with him. He said he didn't realize it, but I got even with him. And I told my friend, I said, "Well, as bullheaded as I am, if he'd have pulled that stunt on me, I'd have told him, okay, don't pay me and don't bring me any more TVs to fix." And my friend said, "Well, I really couldn't afford to do that. I was making too much money off of this guy." So yeah, there you go. So this TV, back to the problem at hand, shut off on us. And when we turned off the set, I heard a weird noise. It sounded like it was coming from the high voltage section. When we turn the TV back on, sometimes it tries to start. You'll get sound for a couple of 3 seconds and then it shuts off again. Other times it does nothing. So I'm really hoping an electrolytic capacitor opened up, but I'm not going to dig into this too much. With it having a questionable CRT, it's just really not worth putting a lot of time and money into. Now, the proper way to do this would be to obtain a Sam's photo fact for this set, and right now I don't even know what Sam's this set requires because the model tag is so faded that I can't look up a correct number. Back in the day when I had all my Sam's photo facts, I would have simply pulled all the Zenith folders from the date range that this set was made and just looked at every one of them until I found one that had a chassis that matched this set, and we'd have used that one. But I don't have all my photo facts anymore. I got rid of all of those back when I thought I was done with TVs like this. And I'm not going to pay Sam's $22 for a downloadable copy that's probably not the best quality. The TV's probably not worth $22, frankly. So instead of doing the proper schematic troubleshooting and diagnosis routine, we're going to just pull the main board out and do some hunting and pecking. If I can't find anything, we'll pull the high voltage board out and do some hunting and pecking. And then if we can't find anything there, that's probably going to be the end of the line for this set. I do remember this 2-section filter can back here on the main board. That was a fairly common failure. So I want to check that. And like I said, check some caps on this high voltage module. And like I said, if that doesn't take care of it, this one's probably going to the scrap heap. I did last night, just out of curiosity, look on the internet for this tube type, and of course I can't find one readily available. I didn't really think I could, but it's probably just as well, because if I found one, it would probably be more expensive than what the TV's worth. I know about 25 years ago, the local parts house was trying to get rid of all of their old CRTs, and they were selling some of them for as little as, I think, $10 or $15 a piece just to get them out of there. I know I bought a couple of $20 color tubes from him to put in sets that I was working on. And then they moved all of the picture tubes from that store to the store down on the coast. And then when Hurricane Katrina came through and wiped out that store, so did the picture tubes got wiped out with it. So there went all of the picture tubes. Had I known what he was going to do with them and what would have happened to them, I would have tried to have bought every one of them he had. And then we would have at least had picture tubes here for whenever I needed them, or when somebody else needed one, then we could have fixed them up. But anyway, enough blabbering. We're going to pull this main board out and do some more checking, see what I can find, if anything. Alright, there's nothing standing out hitting me in the face as being bad on the main board, so I have the high voltage board pulled out, and this module here is separate from this heatsink. It's not all one replaceable thing. In the newer sets, they had a little circuit board on here for the kickstart circuit. This set does not. All it has is the little transformer there. So I'm just going to go over this board and see if I see any bad connections or capacitors with high ESR, and if we can't find anything in those areas it's bad, I'm probably done with this. And if you find yourself working on one of these sets, always put this insulating material back where you found it. This is supposed to be a flame retardant material. In the early versions of these sets, they didn't use flame retardant material, and there were issues with bad soldering on here that resulted in the connections arcing and catching the insulator on fire, which of course spread to the rest of the TV, which then usually spread to the property in which the TV was contained in. And there were a lot of cases where there was property damage and even some deaths in the early 80s due to Zenith TV fires, but I think they tried to keep that hush-hush. I don't really see any bad soldering on this one just right off the top of my head, but like I said, I'm going to go through and ESR test some of these capacitors. Now, Zenith really didn't intend on anybody to service these boards. In fact, if my memory is correct, the service information from Zenith for these sets didn't contain any type of schematic diagrams for these boards. You pretty much got a block diagram as to how the board's connected, and that was it. They expected you to replace the defective module or modules and be done with it. But it's like a friend of mine told them back then. He said, you know, it's easy for you to say just to replace the whole module when a customer brings in a television that was $299.95 brand new, and whenever you tell them what it's going to cost to replace the whole module plus labor, then they're going to back out of it because that's the majority of the cost of a new television. So yeah, I do remember that the flyback transformer for this board and the older 9-160 module was not available from Zenith as a replacement part. When the flyback went bad, you had to replace the whole module. Of course, that was all fine and good back in the 80s and 90s, but now that the whole module is no longer being made or rebuilt by anybody, then you're going to be up a creek if the flyback goes bad, unless you can find one from a junk board. And that reminds me of the only time that I ever replaced a 19-inch trifocus picture tube in one of these types of sets. It was in one of the 9-160 module base sets, and the guy who I did it for had two televisions. One of them had a severely weak picture tube in it. The other one had a flyback transformer that was arcing severely, which was a common problem on the 9-160 boards. So I simply took the good CRT out of the set with the arcing flyback and put it in the other television that had a good chassis but a bad picture tube, and well, it worked and the guy was happy. Now, would it have been worth replacing the tube had I had to buy a new one? Not by a long shot, because that set was already about 13 or 14 years old at the time, and it would not have been worth putting a new picture tube in. Alright, 22 microfarad 25 volt capacitor in the horizontal driver stage, reading about 5 ohms ESR. That's a bit high, but I'm not convinced it's high enough to cause our problem. And now we'll check a new 22 microfarad 25 volt cap. And here's a new 22 microfarad 25, actually 63 volt cap. It's a good bit smaller than the original 25 volt cap. So yeah, even since the early 80s, caps have gotten smaller. But yeah, that's a little less than an ohm there, so that's a lot better. And as far as capacitance, it is reading a little weak at 18 microfarads, should be 22. And this could be a case where if I put the TV back together with this capacitor from an extremely cold start, it might fire up and play a few minutes. And then as it heats up, this capacitor might worsen and shut it down. So we're going to stick the new capacitor in and see what takes place. And this new one reads right at 22, so that's good. Right, everything's reinstalled. I think I have everything plugged in correctly. Now let's go fire it up and see what it does. Okay, the moment of truth. I don't think that did a thing for us. Nope, not one bit of good. Well, I'm just about to the point of throwing in the towel on this one. Alright, when I disconnected the tuner control module, it does this now. It's trying even harder to start, but nothing's happening. Disconnected the other cable going to the tuner control. Let's see what... Nothing. And I disconnected this other cable to the tuner control board. That other was actually the tuner, and I'll tell you in a minute why I did that. So let's plug it back in and see what happens. Nope, no different. Alright, I've got the TV plugged into the Variac. I've got it set at 90 volts. We're going to see if it'll start at a lower voltage. If it does, that'll suggest that the high voltage shutdown is kicking in, and then we're going to try it at a higher voltage and see what happens. Okay, at a lower voltage, it tries to start. And then whenever I raise the input, it shuts down. Alright, at about 100 volts, alright, I'm not seeing any raster. Okay, so what we figured out so far is, well, we changed the capacitor in the horizontal drive circuit that was a bit marginal, but obviously that didn't help the problem. So we figured out by means of the Variac that if we try to run the set at around 90 to 100 volts, it makes more of an effort to start, but we still get no HV and there's no filaments in the CRT neck. If we bring it up to if we increase it to 120 volts, it just shuts down completely. So that suggests that we have our voltage, our B plus voltage, is not regulating. But I believe the regulation in these sets is dependent on whether or not the horizontal driver circuit is working properly. So if there's an issue in the horizontal sweep circuit, then the then the power supply is not going to regulate properly. Now, I do remember these sets being rather complex, and they could be a rather huge pain in the butt to service. I'm trying to think of what came after this particular chassis. I don't remember the module numbers, but there was one after this one that had a more simplified power supply. It had a stand-up high voltage board on the right, and then another stand-up board on the left that contained a series pass 120 volt or 130 volt, whatever it was, regulator IC. And then the signal module that laid down flat in the bottom of the set. Like I said, I don't remember the module numbers, and I don't think they made that particular chassis very long. The one after that was the 9-470 module, and that's when they were getting more to a one board chassis. On sets with mechanical tuners, all you had was the 9-470 main board and the CRT video output module, and that was it. The ones with electronic tuning, of course, had a tuner module and a standby power supply. I think the 9-470 sets were made for a few years, from about 86 until about 91 or 92. And then in the late 80s they came out with the single board chassis. Now, I'm talking about just the 19 and 20 inch sets. They had a single board chassis. That was the first one that had the STR 53041 switching regulator on it. And on those sets, I remember the main problems with those was dried out caps in the power supply that would blow up that regulator IC, and dried out caps in the vertical circuit. And those gave pretty good service and had a nice picture when you had one with a good jug in it. And then after those came like the, what was it, the 9-1130 module, and that was everything on one board. And by that time we were starting to get into the bad CRT era that I think I might have mentioned earlier, where the tubes would either intermittently short and burn up the power supply or the video output stage, or they would get weak and of course give you a lousy picture. And rejuvenation really didn't do nothing to help them. It's kind of hard to improve on a CRT that was a piece of trash to begin with. And they used those crappy tubes from about, roughly about 92 until 98, I believe, and that's when they closed down the Zenith / Rawland CRT plant and started using bonded yoke Thompson RCA tubes and then Phillips tubes. Now, the Thompson and the Phillips tubes, they held up pretty good. But by that time, it was pretty much game over for Zenith, and then Gold Star swallowed them up completely in 1999, I believe. So, I actually know where a couple of those later Zeniths are with the bonded yoke Thompson picture tube, and they're still in pretty good working order. Oh, and I said I was going to mention to you why I unplugged the tuner and the tuner control module. Years ago, a church that my cousin attended, their TV went out, and it was one of those big wooden cased table model rectangular Zeniths from about 1983 or 84. I think it was one of those you could screw legs on the bottom of it and make it into a cheap console, but they had it sitting on one of those metal roll around carts with the VCR on the middle shelf. And seeing as how it was a church TV, it probably saw very little use, probably a few hours a year, if that much. Well, it went out, and my cousin, instead of them trying to get that one fixed, he just come and got another TV from me, and they gave me the old Zenith. And it was doing something very similar to this. You could turn it on, and we had very little high voltage, which I don't even think this one has any high voltage, and we had moaning noise in the speaker, and all of our supply voltages were low. every last supply voltage was considerably lower than it should have been. So I'm pulling my hair out trying to figure out why all of the supply voltages are low. And then I disconnected the tuner control module, and this set was a bit newer than this one. It had the updated tuner and tuner control module that was all built into the same package and mounted directly up here on the front of the TV. You TV technicians will know what I'm talking about, but I unplugged the tuner / control module, and all of our supply voltages came up. We had full high voltage, everything was great, except obviously the tuner wasn't working because I had it unplugged. So I got to digging around, and inside the tuner control module there was a large value electrolytic capacitor. I believe it was either a 1000 or a 2200, something like that, at 25 volts. And it was in the B plus supply line to the control module, and that capacitor inside the tuner control module was dead shorted. You don't see these low voltage electrolytics dead short very often, but it does happen occasionally. And whenever I replaced that capacitor, the TV came to life and played beautifully. So that's the reason I went ahead and unplugged all this, just in case there was something in here that was loading things down. But unfortunately that was not the problem. So right now I'm at a standstill on this set. I haven't yet decided if I want to go further on it or not. If I can find out what the Sam's photo fact is for this particular set and come up with one cheap, then we might dive into this further. But yes, the picture tube is still usable, but we know it's a bit on the tired side, and quite frankly I'm just not interested in sinking any substantial amount of money in this set. Now if it was in perfect cosmetic shape and had a perfect jug in it, then I would be more inclined to do more to it. But pretty much my only motivation for going further into this is to try to figure out exactly what's wrong with it. But a Sam's photo fact would help out greatly in that endeavor, and since we don't have that right now, then we're pretty much at a standstill. Years ago I had several cabinets of Sam's photo facts on later TVs. Now when I say later, I mean from early 1970s up until the early 2000s. There was a TV shop here in town in the late 90s that was going out of business, and he subscribed to the Photo Fact of the Month Club, which means he had every Sam's that they ever put out from the time they went in business up until the time he got out of business. And he had a lot of older Sam's that he inherited from various shops that he worked for before he went in business for himself. You know, at one time this town was full of TV shops, but that's back when TVs were actually worth fixing. But anyway, back then, I think in the late 90s, a new photo fact was something like 22 bucks, I believe, which was really ridiculous. And by that time, all you got was one television for your $22. Back in the day, a photo fact was what, $3.95, and you got 10 or 15 different items in the same folder. So he said, I'd really like for you to buy all these photo facts from me. I don't have any use for them anymore. I said, what do you want for them? And he thought a minute, and he said, well, what about $1,000 for all of them? Now at that time that was probably a fair price, because you know there was still a good bit of TV repair going on. And I said, well, I don't have a problem with the price, but you know, there's just no way I can come up with $1,000 to hand you. And he said, well, if you can pay me a little bit along, that'll work too, because I need to get them out of here. So that's what we agreed to do. And I paid him until they were paid for, and then I used those Sam's a great deal until it got to the point where it was no longer worthwhile to fix televisions. And then I ended up dumping all of those Sam's photo facts, because at that time I really had no intentions of ever messing with a television again. And then fast forward a few years and I start getting interested in older televisions again. So, you know, so now I'm wishing I'd have hung on to all of those Sams. Now on the older televisions, like the tube stuff, there's usually people on eBay and various other places selling individual folders for reasonable amounts of money, but I haven't seen any for sale on this later stuff. But I don't know, we're gonna end this for now. If I decide to work on this again, you'll see a part 2. And if I decide not to fool with it any longer, then you won't see a part 2, and that's just the way it is. But my decision to work on this will probably be solely based on whether or not I can find a Sam's photo fact, because as complicated as this power supply and horizontal drive circuit is, I really don't want to just dive into this not knowing what's what. I would love to have a schematic in front of me to make things a lot simpler. So there you go. That's about all I've got for this video. And there'll be more to come later, whether it be on this TV or something else. As far as modules, there were several different versions of the 9-186 high voltage module. The later version, the one that had the little startup board here on the heatsink, had an orange wire coming out of this drive transformer that connected to the startup board. And also on those sets that had the standard inline gun tube, they had a single round connector for the focus voltage, whereas this one has a rectangular connector with 2 leads. And I think there was also an updated 9-181 signal module for those sets that had the startup board here on the heatsink. But on this particular set, according to this, our high voltage module is a 9-18601, and the signal module is a 9-181-02. And then they list a 9-181 universal field replacement. Maybe that's the one that came with all of the ICs installed, I don't know. And then we have a 9-190 tuner control module, and then we have a 175-2030 tuner. Now I don't think there's any issue with the tuner or the control module. The issue is either going to be somewhere on this horizontal output and high voltage module, or on the signal module. And these sets can be confusing. You can think it's on the signal module and change it, and then the trouble will be on the high voltage module and vice versa. Or, like I think I already previously said, there can be issues on both modules, and you can change one module and the issue on the remaining module can screw up the module you just replaced. I've ran into that before on both the older 9-160 sets and these newer sets. As far as I'm concerned, the best System 3 chassis was the first one that had the 9-153 module and the ferro-resonant transformer. That one didn't really have any kind of goofy voltage regulator circuit in it, but when they came out with a 9-160 module that they refer to as the electronic power sentry voltage regulator, then that's when things really started going to heck in a handbasket for Zenith. Actually, my favorite Zeniths are the Chromacolor 2s with the Delta gun tube and the upright modular chassis, and the older 25-inch solid state horizontal chassis that looks like a tube chassis, the 25 EC45 or 55, I don't remember. And then there was a 25 DC 56, and those Delta gun tubes from the Chromacolor 2 era, it's rare to find one that's bad. I've run into a couple that were weak but still usable, and I found one that was in an early vertical chassis 25-inch set that had instant on, that was completely dead, but it bounced back after a rejuvenation. I don't know how long it lasted, but it came back for a while anyway. And then the later Chromacolor 2s, they started using the inline EFL gun like what was in the System 3s. I think that started in the 77 model year. And those continued to be made until about 79, I believe. And then the System 3 chassis with the 9-153 module came out, I believe, early part of 78 for the 79 model year. I think that chassis was only made for maybe a year, year and a half, and then that's when they came out with the horrid 9-160 module equipped System 3s. I think the last Chromacolor 2 chassis with a Delta gun was the 23 LC45 for the 1980 model year, and by that time Zenith had pretty much already gone to the System 3 chassis for everything except that one 23-inch Chromacolor 2 entry-level set that was offered in a console, and I think it was also offered in a tin can table model set. And I believe there was even a version of that table model set that had motorized remote control tuning with an ultrasonic remote. But like I said, that 23 LC45 series from 1980, that was just an entry-level model set to use up remaining Chromacolor 2 parts and such, because they had already gone pretty much full System 3 style chassis by 1980. I did not really care for the Chromacolor 2 sets with the inline gun tube in them because they used an oddball tripler that I've ran into that would short the high voltage through the focus lead and send high voltage up through the focus lead and then burn up the tube socket, and in some cases damage the tube itself, so didn't really care for those. And those EFL gun inline tubes didn't hold up as well as the Delta gun tubes. They weren't as bad as what Zenith used in the 90s, but they were not. I was thinking that I may have a photo fact on the 13-inch version of this set if I can lay my hands on it, and hopefully that'll be close enough that we can troubleshoot this. And I think we've gone past the stage of quote-unquote hunt and peck troubleshooting with the ESR meter, hoping to find a bad capacitor that's causing our problem. I really don't think it's a capacitor at this point. And I think it's about time to put this TV up on the workbench, and it's probably going to need a date with the oscilloscope so I can trace through the horizontal driver stage and try to find out where I'm losing it, if that's indeed the problem. So, but we're not going to do that in this video. We've taken enough time in this video that if I decide to do anything further with this, there'll be a part 2. And I was sitting here thinking about the old Zenith Chromacolor 2 sets, and I like those a lot better because they're more straightforward, and they do not obtain most of the operating voltages off of the flyback. Most of the operating voltages for the old Chromacolor 2 sets were obtained directly off of the power transformer, which means if the horizontal sweep circuit fails, the TV doesn't die altogether. You generally still have audio and something to work with, and there's no complicated solid-state regulation circuitry to blow up or regulation circuitry that's dependent on horizontal drive and the proper load from the flyback transformer. Those sets use a ferro-resonant power transformer and an oil-filled capacitor to make up the regulation circuitry. As far as problems on those old Chromacolor 2s, the main troubles I had were faulty module connections that could usually be solved by cleaning the contacts and resoldering the pins. I ran into a lot of bad triplers. They would usually either short internally and trip the circuit breaker, or the case would crack and they'd arc to the chassis, and that's usually when people would get rid of the set, because I found that once a set starts arcing and sparking and smoking and making fire, that's when the homeowner, the lady of the house, decides she wants to get rid of that TV. I know one of our sets one time, the vertical IC shorted and popped the fuse resistor, and that created a minor pop compared to what an arcing tripler creates, and my mother let me know that TV popped and I smelt it. I don't want that TV back in the house. I don't care if you can fix it. I don't trust it anymore. Occasionally I'd run into one where the tripler would short and take out the flyback and the horizontal output transistor. I actually had that happen one time on one of the old flat chassis solid state Zeniths, 25 DC56 or whatever it was, and I think that was because the set owner probably kept holding the circuit breaker in and there was no protection, or else the circuit breaker failed and didn't trip. And then that oil-filled bathtub cap would sometimes short and trip the circuit breaker. That was a fairly common problem. And those were the main issues I ran into. Vertical modules, there were issues with those that could usually be fixed easy enough, usually with capacitors, sometimes a transistor or two. Ran into a few horizontal driver transformers with open windings. I think there was an electrolytic capacitor off of the emitter of the horizontal output transistor that would dry out and open and cause the horizontal output transistor to overheat and short. Picture tubes rarely ever gave problems in those sets. Like I think I already mentioned, I only remember one of them that was dead and a couple of others that were weak but still usable. Now that's for the Delta gun tubes. The inline tubes, that's a different story. But yeah, I've got a couple of Chromacolor 2 sets here that we need to fix one day. One's a entry-level model from 78, and the other one is I think from 75. It's a remote set that uses a 4-button clicker. I think the 78 model will produce a picture. The other one, I think it trips the circuit breaker, so it's got a short somewhere in it. And I've got a 19-inch Chromacolor 2 with the inline gun tube and a built-in AM/FM radio. That one came out of a motel somewhere, and I think I've got a 13-inch Chromacolor 2 with the inline gun tube. So those I'm probably definitely going to fix and keep as long as the jugs are in good shape in them. But anyway, enough babbling on about this. I will try to procure a photo fact for this set, and if I can find one, then we'll probably dive back into this later, but it won't be out here on the boardwalk going to my shop. It will actually be in the shop. And like I said, I'm sure we'll have the oscilloscope fired up too. And I seem to remember a similar problem with the 9-160 sets where they would lose horizontal drive and try to start and wouldn't start, and would motorboat in the speaker, and you know, all kind of weird problems. So we'll try to dive back into this one day. You know, even though it's on borrowed time, I'd still kind of like to find out what the trouble is, so in case some of you run up on a similar situation, it might help you fix your set. And some of you ex-TV repairmen watching this may know exactly what's wrong with this one, and if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear from you. You know, even though I've been doing this for 30 years, there's a lot that I've forgotten about some of these sets. Some of it I tried to forget. And I don't claim to be a know-it-all. You know, as long as I'm still doing this, I'll be learning. So, you know, if anybody has any ideas, then feel free to comment. Otherwise, I'll just wait until I can find a proper schematic, and we'll probably dive back into this one day. All right, that's enough. And more to come later, whether it be this set or something else.